Hello, welcome to the interview here on France 24. Well, 6 months into Syria's Arab Spring uprising, anti-regime protesters show few signs of throwing in the towel. But neither, however, does Syria's strongman, President Bashar Assad. Now, unlike in Egypt and Tunisia, where the army refused to intervene and fire on the protesters, in Syria, the army has so far at least remained quite loyal to their commander, Bashar Assad. The question we're asking today is, will this change and can it change? And my guest today thinks that perhaps that will depend on the ability of the protest movement to grow and spread and to draw in some other key elements of Syrian society. Bilal Saab, welcome. You're joining us from Washington, D.C. today. You are a specialist security, arms control, counterterrorism issues across the Middle East. You are a PhD candidate at the University of Maryland in the United States, and you're also a fellow at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. I'd like to begin right away with Syria. We have seen these protesters come back again and again and again, despite this crackdown, which has claimed over 2,700 lives so far, according to the UN. They keep hanging on, and so does Assad. Do you see anything that's going to change in this dynamic? Why have the protesters been unable so far to really achieve their goal, which is to topple Assad?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on the show. It's a privilege. Look, the short answer is that the economic interests of the Sunni merchant class or the Sunni business community lie in the survival of the Assad regime for now. It's very simple. If you just do a cost-benefit calculation, I'm a Syrian trader and I'm looking at my interests, they simply lie at this point with the Syrian regime. So, and having that large constituency not joining the Syrian protester movement is really, it's just bad news for the Syrian protesters. So that's one reason. The other reason is very simply that the Syrian regime has done a, unfortunately, successful job at repressing. I mean, they've used all sorts of harsh repression that perhaps no other authoritarian regime in the history of the world has actually used. It's just absolutely very harsh repression. And then the third answer is simply that you know, the international community has come up with some really strong measures against the Syrian regime, but they're limited. And targeted sanctions have done. Go ahead.
Well, I'm sorry. You're saying, you know, there have been sanctions so far. You were talking. You mentioned the Sunni merchants. They're sitting on the fence. But what might be the tipping point? I mean, the business opportunities from the reports we've been getting, they have been slowly drying up. Business is not as usual as it was before this uprising.
Business is not as usual, and I'm hoping, and it's really hard to quantify it and do really some systematic economic analysis on this, but I'm hoping that in the medium term to long term, which, I mean, it could take a year, if not more, by then the Syrian merchant class will find that it's intolerable to stay sided with the regime, and by then make a choice, a crucial one, to side with the protesters. But for now, things are really looking well in Damascus. Business is still booming. It's just in other areas that it has started to dry up.
But wait, okay, they're doing well in Damascus, in your words, but does this mean we are all, the world has to sit by and wait another year? I mean, we've had 2,700 die in the past 6 months, so what, we're going to see hundreds more die and sanctions being ineffective and nothing really happening, and Assad just sitting there in control?
No, I completely understand the urgency of doing something, but doing something irrational is simply not going to really help things or really offer any material assistance to the protesters. There's a dilemma here when it comes to sanctions. So far, the target sanctions have actually done a good job hurting the regime. They've made it much more costly for them to sell their oil, to do business with parts of the Arab world, to just simply survive on a daily basis like they've done before. But as long as they're targeted, and look, the Syrian regime has done a good job actually finding alternatives to the European Union in terms of oil market. They've done business now with the Malaysians and other Asian countries. And look, there's going to be a temptation on the part of the international community, especially the American side, to switch from targeted sanctions to comprehensive sanctions, simply because they see that the targeted sanctions have not been enough.
But
when they do that, Go ahead.
I'm sorry to interrupt here, but just to jump in, I mean, we all know Russia has been the primary blocker to this type of move within the Security Council, and what we keep hearing every time the sanctions issue comes up is this fear that if Assad goes, it will lead to instability, insecurity across the region. But how much more insecure can you get than the present situation?
Well, that's a very good point. I mean, the bottom line of a lot of conservative analysis in the United States and elsewhere is that, better the devil you know, which is that Assad, we know him, he's predictable, he's keeping the borders with Israel pretty secure and
But he's not predictable. I'm sorry,
stable.
Bilal, I'm sorry to interrupt. He's not predictable in the sense that a lot of people saw him as the early reformer, but now he's proving, it seems to be almost as repressive as his father was.
I'm relaying the message of basically in Washington, and I pretty much disagree with it. I've actually argued against that. But it's a really strong sentiment in Washington, and especially in Israel as well. But I mean, I agree with you. He's pretty much unpredictable at home, but when it comes to foreign policy, you got to be also honest and objective and say that he's been pretty predictable.
What do you think the army factor? I just want to ask you about the army now, because I mentioned in the beginning that in Egypt and Tunisia, you saw the army sort of siding with the protesters. That has not been the case so far with Syria. Why not?
Simply because of the very structure of the Syrian army and how closely allied it is with the regime. It is based on sectarian loyalties, some very complex financial inducements that they get from the regime. It's also a family network, very different from the Egyptian case.
So do you see the possibility, though, as we see more and more, we hear reports of people defecting to the other side to join the protesters, will there be a balance that's tipped at a certain point? Will you have high-level officers perhaps going over to the other side?
Look, it's possible, but it's going to require a lot of, regional coordination, especially with the Turks, the United States, offering really massive financial inducements. I mean, these people risk not only torture, but death as well. You've heard that a lot of defection has actually led to the death of those defectors. So, I mean, if I'm a Syrian soldier, I'm really weighing my options here. It's very risky.
I'd like to just turn our attention in the little time we have left, Bilal, to the situation in Libya. Obviously different than Syria, because there you've had Gaddafi essentially fallen, toppled, but still fighting from his last bastions. In Libya itself, there are a lot of concerns about arms, what's going to happen to Gaddafi's arms pouring across borders. How worried are you about the security situation now across the region as a result of what's happened in Libya?
Look, there's no question that Washington is really concerned about the safety and security of the remaining weapons of mass destruction materials. They're not extensive. Let's not overstate how much the Libyans have, because they've really dismantled the nuclear program in 2003. They still have a few chemical agents here and there, but they're really widespread in the country, and it's not really clear who possesses them, even though you still hear that they are under the control of the rebels. But that's a major concern on the part of Washington, non-proliferation, and especially counterterrorism. Next door you've got a country, Algeria, who's fighting an insurgent movement that's pretty potent. I mean,
Algeria.
Al-Qaeda and the Islamic Maghreb, exactly. And they share a long border with the Algerians, which is roughly 1/3 of the total size of the U.S.-Mexican border. And look, any effective government, any normal functioning government is going to have a hard time securing that frontier.
Let me ask you.
Let alone Libyan government, which is not even present, and you don't even have a Libyan army.
That was my question. You used the words normal functioning government. The National Transitional Council is yet to form a government in Libya. You've suggested in the past, you've questioned their ability, even their willingness to secure the country's borders to prevent arms from spreading. Do you still have those concerns? I think you were writing a few months back.
Yeah, look, I don't want to overstate the issue of willingness, because we really don't know. I mean, on record, we have them saying that they are perfectly willing to cooperate with the United States and the international community as far as security. But as far as ability, this is where real concerns abound. I mean, this is a very, divided, first of all, rebel movement. They're fighting within their own constituency. And they have limited capabilities. They are being aided by a lot of intelligence agents from regional countries and from the international community, but still the risk of proliferation is medium to high.
What do you think right now, so long as Gaddafi is still out there, remains uncaptured, holding out, is there any chance that this government can govern the country effectively?
I sure hope so. I mean, it's really hard to say at this point how the transition is going to be. It's going to be definitely rocky. If history is any guide, with all sorts of other transitions from dictatorial rule to representative government. But you have to go through that, and it's a gradual process. Do I have confidence in the ability of the Libyans to govern themselves? Absolutely. But along the way is going to be a lot of bumps, and it's that transitional period that's going to create all sorts of uncertainty and a number of concerns on the part of the international community, especially the United States.
Are you worried about the divides right now? We've heard, or are we making too much of it perhaps, between the Islamists, the secularists within Libya, the divides within the country, and the fact that they're never really going to be able to unify, and that Libya could become a loose cannon in the region, or hostile at least to the U.S. and Europe?
Am I concerned? Yes. How much am I concerned? I don't know. I really am not a specialist on Libya, but it is certainly an issue. And it's an issue that is no secret. Even themselves, they've actually had public fights between the liberal movement within part of the Transitional Council and the Islamists themselves. How that's going to play out, it's really hard to say. But there's got to be some sort of a cooperative arrangement to come up with a new social contract. I mean, this is really starting from scratch. And to exclude one at the expense of the other is certainly not an option. But, coming together is certainly not going to be easy.
Okay, Bilal Saab, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm going to put you on the spot just before we go, the 20 seconds we have left. Going back to Syria, how long and when do you think it will be that Bashar Assad goes? Very quickly.
I have no idea, to be honest. It's going to be very unpredictable. The stalemate continues. And before the Syrian protesters reach a critical mass, it's hard to say when this regime will collapse.
That is fair enough. I'll let you stay on the fence there. I guess no one really knows. Bilal Saab, Middle East expert, you've joined us from Washington, D.C. You're a fellow at the Monterey Institute of International Studies. You've been our guest today here on The Interview at France 24. Thanks to all of you for watching as well.
It's a pleasure. Thanks.